your conference. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today. I really want to thank Gabriele and Paolo Corvo for inviting me today. And I try to share my PowerPoint, so please let me know if you can see.
And is to take the occasion to also to welcome to my colleague Gabriele Proglio that present Giulia in the past, and then Gabriele is a historian, and then this arrived in our university in October of the last year, and then it's a very important component of our staff.
Thank you.
Okay, so can you see my screen and my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I can start, right? Okay. Okay, thank you. So, in April 2012, the Swedish Minister of Culture, Lena Adelsohn Liljeroth, was involved in a mediatic scandal after her attendance to the celebration of the World Art Day at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm. The minister was photographed while she was cutting at the genitals level a big chocolate pie shaped like a black woman. The head, instead, was the one of the artist himself, Makode Eilinde, who stated that he wanted to shed light on the practice of female genitals mutilation. The scene produced by the performance was at very least problematic. While the minister dug the knife in the fake body and revealed an extremely realistic inside, an exclusively white public observed the scene, laughing at a woman pie who was at the same time symbolically mutilated and actually consumed. The performance attracted criticism and disapproval by the African Association of Sweden and by several anti-racist associations that demanded the resignation of the minister. I don't want to get into the substance of the artist's intentions nor of the controversy, but I'm interested in analyzing the symbolic and factual connection between chocolate and blackness that leads to the concrete consumption of both the pie and the black body. Some years later, in 2017, the Committee Against Racist Sweets launched a petition on change.org requesting to change the name of Moretto chocolate, produced by the Swedish company Dabbler and originally called Morenkopf, which means head of Moor. The case of the Swedish pie, of Moretto chocolate, and of Italian negrettino, in Italian negrettino is a diminutive of the N word, are included in a long tradition that associates blackness with chocolate, cocoa, and coffee, and that carries specific symbolic, historical, and social meanings. The consumption of these foods is rooted in the European colonial history that, with the conquest of South America, Africa, and other territories of the global South, started the production of commodities within the colonial and slave system. As was the case of many other commodities during the colonial period, the availability of low-cost workforce generated by different forms of slavery provided Western countries with food products unknown in the global North and for which a specific market segment was created. This is illustrated, for example, by the production of cocoa beans originally located in Central and South America and from the 20th century moved to West Africa, where there was a better environment and a wide availability of low-cost workforce. Coffee and cocoa are included in a set of goods that inside the colonial system allowed Western countries to create a circuit of production and consumption and of an economic model based on the power imbalance between global North and South. As Anya Lumba pointed out, these power relations, structured on the categories of race and class, allowed the capitalistic development of Western powers, and I quote, "The crucial point is that even if European colonialisms realized several forms of domination, penetrating in deep some society while maintaining superficial contacts with others, in all cases they produced the necessary imbalance for the growth of European capitalism and industry. We can say that without the colonial expansion, the European transition towards capitalism would not have occurred." End quote. So what is, from a cultural perspective, the specificity of coffee and cocoa? These products are particularly interesting for an analysis of intersection between food and racial categories because they are supposedly naturally connected with blackness. With different modalities across historical periods and geographical contexts, chocolate and coffee, or the cultural function assigned to them, have been rendered racial signifiers and indicators of social differences based on race and gender. From a certain moment on, these products, in addition to be racialized, were also strongly sexualized and erotized, and the circuit of connections between gender, sexuality, race, color, desire were built around them. The assignation of these cultural meanings to products coming from former European colonies and produced by people subjugated to the imperial and capitalist power of the global north makes the intersection between product, blackness, and representation particularly useful in order to explore the many ways in which the colonial past resurfaces in the present days. The association between blackness and cocoa or coffee occurred in the first years of commercialization of these new products. Already in the 19th century, advertisements were based on a close relationship between products and people historically associated with their production, which means slaves. As Silke Akenesh argues, between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in the United States, advertisements of cocoa and coffee used stereotyped images of Native Americans and Africans who worked in the fields in order to emphasize the authenticity of the products, representing a natural and harmonious atmosphere and celebrating the serenity of the country life in opposition with the chaos of modern society. And I quote, "The images of brown-skinned laborers assured the buying populace that the article was not an imitation, but genuine. This visual rhetoric suggests a search for authenticity in an environment perceived to be increasingly artificial." End quote. These images obscure the real condition of exploitation and oppression that made the production of coffee and cocoa so convenient for Western countries, which constituted at the same time the point of origin of economic power and the place of consumption. Through the invisibilization of slavery inside the production process, the commercial strategy leveraged the association of Black workers and these foods, placing itself at the intersection between racialization, primitivism, and exotism, because Black bodies evoked an ancestral and archaic imaginary which guaranteed the genuineness of the product. The tendency to associate the product with the subject it produces can also be seen in the advertising posters of several Italian companies. Brands such as Foschi or Industria Italiana Surrogati Caffè, founded in 1929 and 1936, in the 50s and 60s advertised their products by building a symbolic link based not so much or not yet on proximity on a chromatic level, the color of coffee and cocoa and the color of the skin of African workers, as on the concrete and material proximity between workers and the products of the fields, using the presence of the workers as a guarantee for the product itself. Traces of this trend, albeit with different elements, can still be found in the Kimbo coffee commercial on 1988, which stages an ideal company in which Black male and female workers produce and consume coffee while dancing and singing. And I would like to show you this brief video.
Cosa c'è di speciale nel caffè Kimbo? Kimbo faz a história, o grano do café, das partes do arte, da arte do café, uma mistura rica, o Kimbo pra você, exala com o aroma, o gosto do café. Kimbo faz assim, o melhor café. Caffè Kimbo, un caffè speciale.
The proposed scenario, wrapped in an atmosphere that mixes joy, pleasure, and seduction, represents a distorted image of the mechanism of action that eclipses the history of slavery connected to them, while recalling the overlap between products and material producers. This association can still be seen in the 2015 Lavazza calendar.
Cosa c'è di speciale nel caffè Kimbo?
Whose photographs, taken by Steve McCurry, depict farmers and small producers in Ethiopia, Laos, Senegal, and other countries. The campaign slogan, Earth Defenders, connotes the people portrayed as the true and perhaps the only protectors of their land and by extension of the entire planet, proposing an image in which the population of the global south seem to live in a condition of total connection with nature and are therefore positioned at a lower stage of development. In the new trend of ethical consumption, however, this connotation is rendered in a celebratory terms. Compared to a West that devastates the environment and seems to have given up the attempt to correct its lifestyles in a more sustainable way, the populations traditionally considered backward and underdeveloped are actually the ones who will save it, hence the title of the campaign, The Guardians of the Earth. The strategy used here constitutes a further example of benevolent racism, continuing the historical and by no means new trend that advertises coffee through the bodies of those who actually produce it, and at the same time brands both the company and its customers as ethically aware and socially responsible. Thus, the alterization of the people who grow coffee for Europe is wrapped in a primitive rural atmosphere and therefore considered more genuine and authentic compared to an industrialized West. At the same time, the visualization of producers serves the dual function of connoting both the company and the consumers as sensitive to social inequalities and giving the impression that producing communities have some kind of decision-making power within the production cycle. In the images of the beginning of the century, the permanence of the juxtaposition between product and body is made possible thanks to a mystification of reality through the elision of the brutal characters of the history of slavery that characterized the colonial industry and their replacement with an almost joyful representation of industrial production. The construction of a so-called natural working class through racial categories was thus represented in visual form, naturalizing historically determined power relations and wrapping such representation with spontaneity and lightness. The commodification of black bodies also expresses the shift described by Anne McClintock from scientific racism to what she calls commodity racism, through which the narrative of imperial progress is converted into a spectacle of mass production and consumption, and racial difference is no longer postulated only on a scientific level, but also on a visual one. This discursive apparatus intersects in advertising and since the 80s with the colonial stereotype of the Black Venus, which historically constructed the image of the Black women as sexually unfulfilling, instinctual, and bearers of an animalistic erotic charge. The Black Venus is one of the figures of race that pervade the social and cultural landscape and inform both the symbolic representational context and the material context of social relations. I will therefore analyze the reproposition of this figure within contemporary Italian advertisings, highlighting in particular its connections with the politics of taste and sexuality. While in the United States, the advertising industry underwent a great acceleration starting from the 50s, in concomitance with the economic boom and the consequent need to sell a greater quantity of products. In the 50s, Italy was carrying on the difficult process of post-war reconstruction. From the 60s, an Italian advertising industry experienced the phase of greater development. It was in these same years that the image of the housewife as a consumer was affirmed, above all in response to new products coming from overseas. This trend begins to consolidate the advertising tradition that represents the woman as the angel in the house, constantly and exclusively dedicated to the care of the domestic space, of her husband, and of her children. Later on, the image of the woman as caregiver was joined by its opposite, the seductive woman, whose body and sensuality were symbolically sold together with the product. Women who play this role in advertisings are confined to the sexual sphere, while their identities are reduced to portions of their bodies, which are also eroticized. The structuring of such a gender binarism is not a new phenomenon. On the contrary, it represents the application to the advertising industry of a historically and consolidated tradition of representation of femininity divided into the two dichotomous figures of the good woman and bad woman. This opposition can be found in multiple aspects of social life and culture. The pervasiveness and stratification of this discursive construction has maintained its dominant characters until today, and despite the fact that relations between genders have undergone changes and remodulations since the 70s, advertising as well as the collective imaginary have not acknowledged these transformations, precisely because this binarism is reproposed and reinforced through its daily repetition in shared and widespread cultural practices. In addition to proposing and stabilizing specific gender relations, the contemporary Italian advertising landscape appears strongly racially connotated. At least until 2019, commercials and billboards have been marked predominantly by whiteness, as advertising discourse has assigned black and non-white bodies to the marketing almost exclusively of precise food products such as cocoa, coffee, licorice, or to advertisements in which such bodies are associated with the concept of diversity, integration, or non-Italianness. Although during the 2020 there was a slight increase in the presence of black and non-white subjects, even in advertisements that do not fall into the categories mentioned above, the advertising strategy based on the association between chocolate, coffee, blackness, and eroticism remains, and with it the problematic aspects related to the reproposition of racist and sexist stereotypes. Despite the slight change observed, a large number of chocolate and coffee companies continue to base their advertising strategy on the use of black women's bodies, eroticized and associated with the idea of pleasure and excitement. As Agnes points out, food has often been described through a sexual language. The pleasure derived from the act of eating is often associated to erotic pleasure, and this combination has a long tradition both in popular culture and in the advertising industry. Chocolate as well as coffee are particularly suited to this overlapping, as both are commonly considered as exciting and aphrodisiac foods, therefore naturally connected to sexuality. What I am suggesting is that from a certain moment onwards, the strong sexual charge associated at the social level with black women, the basis of the stereotype of Black Venus, and the appeal to eroticism considered proper to chocolate and coffee, as well as the chromatic proximity between them, were grafted onto an already rooted commercial tradition in which cocoa, coffee, and chocolate were advertised through the use of black bodies. During the 80s in Italy, the use of the image of the seductive woman to advertise any kind of product became stable, while at the same time, the advertising world began to welcome also black models within the explosion of the passion for the ethnic and the exaltation of multiculturalism in the 90s. Thus, an advertising trend for coffee and cocoa products began that replaced black bodies, male and female, whose function and identity had been defined in the previous advertising tradition by their overlap with the plantation system, with bodies of hypersexualized black women. The presence of black women is now determined by their total identification with the product, made possible by visual association at the level of both color and pleasure that it is assumed both can offer. Thus, it seems that three seemingly separate symbolic and visual traditions converge in a new trend. First, the historical and never demolished colonial construction of the black woman as the bearer of an erotic charge bordering on animality. Second, the affirmation of the use of hypersexualized female bodies in advertisements. Third, the equally historical association between black bodies and cocoa and coffee. Thanks to the imposition of an advertising model that leverages the explicit sexuality of women, black female bodies and cocoa, chocolate, and coffee products are symbolically united in a new marketing strategy, exploiting their chromatic proximity and the sexual evocation they seem to naturally carry. While the traditional symbolic juxtaposition between coffee, cocoa, and black workers, which evokes the colonial origin of the product without making erotic elements visible, remains mainly in logos of many Italian brands still on the market today, the advertising strategy is structured around the identification at skin level of the black female body with the advertised product, and in which the entire visual process is enveloped in an atmosphere of sensuality and eroticism, has become widely diffused. The image of the Zicaffe Company, founded in 1929, presents a total fusion between the product and the black model. The latter, decomposed into portions of the body, the lips, the face, the back, disappears in a game of interpenetration with the coffee beans, which represent the mouth, the vertebrae of the column, and an enormous curly hair. The title Black Pleasure evidently alludes both to the pleasure generated by the consumption of coffee and to the sexual pleasure associated with the model. The black female body is symbolically on sale as any blend that can be purchased on the company's website. Along the same lines is the advertising strategy of Abruzzo-based coffee roaster Universal, founded in 1963. Universal's posters widely use black women to advertise their coffee. As can be seen in this figure, the model, framed in the eroticized portions of her body in the mouth and naked shoulder, and the coffee bean became a single body through chromatic uniformity, with a clear erotic illusion, both through the image and through the slogan, "The pleasure of an espresso." Comparing this image to an advertising poster of Bricco Coffee from 1939, in which the bean is humanized and the headline claims, "Coffee is me," it becomes evident how the gender component and the reference to the sexual element are grafted onto an ancient tradition of superimposing the black body with the colonial product. The chocolate and cocoa products industry is not far from this trend. Several companies, such as Parmalat for the advertising of Coppa Malou or Häagen-Dazs for one of its ice creams, have played on the visual level of uniformity and chromatic contrast of the skin of the black models and the advertised product, all presented in a seductive setting. Particularly interesting is the case of Algida's Magnum line of chocolate-based ice creams. The Magnum strategy regularly uses, and not only in Italy, the depiction of a single object that is both a product and a black female body. Through various visual strategies, the black model can become the ice cream itself, and the fusion between the two is rendered graphically through the depiction of skin that breaks down just like the outer layer of the chocolate when bitten, revealing a white interior. This functions both as a further reference to the composition of the product and as a means of contrast to highlight the blackness of the model, of course. Far from being a purely Italian trend, the Magnum line of the French brand Mico achieves, through the games of line and curves, a total identification between ice cream and the naked black female body. In these cases, it is the product that takes the shape of the body and not vice versa, making the representation more stylized and the bodily reference less direct. However, fragments and eroticized bodies, such as buttocks, hips, and backs, are always represented. Finally, in 2003, Magnum launched the Chocolate Possession campaign to advertise chocolates and chocolate bars. In this case, the visual strategy partially changed. Keeping the association between sexual pleasure and chocolate consumption, the advertisement doesn't use a black model, but a white model who becomes black, even if only at the level of skin color, after eating the product. The header, the closed eyes, and the half-open mouth suggest the sensation of ecstasy and pleasure in which the naked body is enveloped, while the concept of possession evokes the semantic and imaginary field of devil and sexuality through the implicit reference to the scenes of gluttony and lust, therefore of everything that is forbidden, sinful, immoral, carnal, and therefore intriguing and seductive. The image constructed seems to communicate that the consumption of the product can satisfy the taste and the erotic desire of the woman, who in turn promises to satisfy the same desires of the male and white consumer. At a further level of analysis, the consumption of chocolate in this case causes a racial transformation. The white model literally changes color, suggesting to potential female consumers the promise of a greater sensuality, but at the same time keeps her hair and other somatic features unchanged, thus reassuring white female consumers that the transformation will only be temporary. Blackness and sexuality are closely intertwined, as if being black automatically and naturally made women sexier, in an image that profiles the reassuring possibility of a transformation that is only temporary because it is not complete, it only involves skin color and hair remains blonde, and because as a possession it is destined to end. It seems, therefore, that the contamination occurs through the concrete act of eating chocolate and therefore the racialized odor. It is this act that the white subject, the model, acquires specific characteristics considered proper to black women, such as sensuality and eroticism, while maintaining her own position of privilege. In addition to the colonial evocation, the transition from whiteness to blackness brings to light the tradition of blackface, a racist practice used in the United States since the late 18th century and especially in the 19th century in the context of the minstrel shows, during which white actors made up with the face painted black and large white or red lips played black characters accentuating the physical features in a caricatural and parodic version based on racist stereotypes. As already pointed out, the entire advertising campaign of the Magnum line has been structured around the concept of pleasure, in most cases according to a strategy that refers not only to a pleasure derived from the taste of chocolate and the eroticism of the models, but also to an aspect linked to the idea of prohibition and danger. As McClintock observes, the rhetoric related to the wild woman who generates both attraction and repulsion in the Western male observer has its roots in the colonial history, when the work of conquering exotic lands and women was extremely exciting and attractive to European colonizers, but also frightening, both because of the aura of mystery that surrounded the conquered bodies and lands, and because of the idea widespread in the Western imagination that the colonized population practiced cannibalism and that women presented monstrous and disturbing physical features. The fact of entering into a relationship with the native women of the conquered territories, therefore, constituted a reason for attraction because it seemed to promise an escape from the bourgeois moralism of Western societies, but at the same time it brought with it the colonial anxiety caused by physical and intimate contact with subjects considered liminal and potentially dangerous. At the same time, products such as chocolate are considered inviting because they bring pleasure, but also unhealthy because they are associated with unhealthy eating habits. Therefore, the two are forbidden. It is not a coincidence that the words pleasure and temptation recur in the official Italian website of the Magnum line, often juxtaposed, where the concept of temptation etymologically refers to the attraction for something that is forbidden or dangerous. This dynamic of attraction and repulsion and visual depiction of pleasure juxtaposed with danger appears evident in the Magnum campaign launched in 2016 entitled Free Your Instincts, in which a number of models, white, black, and non-white models, are filmed in the video spots while working alongside wild animals. The animals chosen are all characterized by being wild animals commonly considered fierce, while in the advertisement they represent alter egos of the models, with whom they are bound by a relation of protection and alliance, as opposed to the rest of the characters who appear excluded from this elective relationship. The campaign was also disseminated through billboards for which a single dominant image was chosen, depicting a face composed half of a non-white woman and half of a tiger. The juxtaposition of the models with the animal and the slogan Free Your Instinct refer to the instinctual, therefore not rational, the animalistic, therefore not human, nature of women, especially non-white women, reproposing their identification with animality wild instincts, unbridled sexuality, and thus reinforce a process of exoticization that places them in an unidentified, mysterious and sensual East, on the periphery of a center, the West, which is white, male, rational, civilized, and productive. The campaign, moreover, was inaugurated in April 2016 with the so-called Animalier Party at the Plastic Club in Milan. The scenography of the event, attended by mainly white guests belonging to the world of entertainment, included the presence of two black models dressed up as tigers dancing locked in a cage. This choice of image, in addition to animalize real human beings already historically placed within an exotic and racist imaginary, brings to mind the human zoos of the 19th and 20th century, when Germany, Spain, Italy, Belgium, France, among others, exhibited human beings from Africa, from the Americas, and from Southeast Asia in fenced exhibition spaces, like any other exotic animal. If human zoos were also functional in moving the inhabitants of the global periphery to the center of imperial metropolises, and in this way in reinforcing by opposition the construction of the Western self, the bars of the cage of the exclusive Milanese party mark the boundary between the white observers and the object of observation, subjected to the white gaze and curiosity, but at the same time kept at a distance. Both the human zoo and the cage perform the function of including unacceptable subjects in white spaces where they can be admitted only if reduced to a stage of non-humanity and only if kept at a proper distance. The boundary, constituted by the bars of the cage as well as by the fences of the zoo, represents the place where the visual construction of what is allowed and what is forbidden is articulated, but also of the relationship observer/observed. In this sense, the observation constitutes a device of reaffirmation of power that sanctions at a visual level the opposition between the white observing subject and the black observed one. It therefore emerges how race, in its intersection with gender and color, is involved in visual representation on more than one level. Firstly, the blackness of the models recalls the colonial origin of the products and thus shows the legacy of colonialism that is transcribed today under less recognizable, though fully visible forms. Secondly, the subjectivity of the depicted women is erased and their identity reassigned to a unitary image in which product and body merge into a single entity. Thirdly, the insistent reference to the erotic component in an animalistic key evoked by black female bodies is in continuity with the tradition that, starting from colonialism, narrated colonized black women as sexual objects placed in a border space between humanity and inhumanity. Finally, the reproposition of the association between colonial products and slave laborers is rooted in the process of removing the historical meaning, namely the colonial and slave history, of which that association is the bearer. In addition to this, the fact that bodies strongly marked from a racial and gender point of view are identified with the food product, therefore destined to be concretely eaten, seems to constitute within a broader racial order an exercise of power for the metaphorical reassertion of white hegemony. As Diana Palardi, who analyzes a similar process in Spain, pointed out, and I quote, "The concept of consumption implies taking possession of something, breaking it down, absorbing part of it into a larger system." In the context of race relations, the symbolic act of consuming the racial other may be associated with the exploitation of the aspect of the other that benefit members of the dominant society. End quote. Through this kind of advertising, the metaphorical consumption of the racialized other associated with the food so strongly linked to the processes of racialization becomes a symbolic space in which the dominant white male subject stabilizes and reinforces his own position of power. As Gaia Giuliani also observes, this process constitutes, and I quote, "a very simple geometry of power where the consumer is white and the consumed, that is, the one reduced to a commodifiable, cannibalizable, and never fully included object, is black," end quote. The double connotation that characterizes the black otherness as an element of both attraction and danger also seems to be incorporated in this process of symbolic cannibalism, in which the act of eating the racialized other also means to overcome fear and assert their power. Reiterating this process, even on a figurative level, seems to exorcise the colonial anxiety of cannibalism and once again reaffirm white supremacy, and I quote from bell hooks: "White racism, imperialism, and sexist domination prevail by courageous consumption. It is by eating the other that one asserts power and privilege." End quote. It's also interesting to observe that the racialization of specific foods doesn't constitute a process involving only blackness, but represents also a functional strategy for the reassertion of white supremacy through a process that is not heteroreferential, namely by means of contrast with the black otherness, but self-referential, which means through self-appropriation and exaltation of the hierarchically superior position of whiteness and of the qualities associated to it. In February 2017, in New York City, a group of neo-Nazis affiliated with the US so-called alt-right, alternative right, protested during an anti-Trump installation by artist Shia LaBeouf entitled "He Will Not Divide Us." During the protest, the neo-Nazis, shirtless and in front of a camera, staged disruptive actions in which, physically exhibiting a presumed virility, they drank and spat milk, claiming that milk is the face of the new white nationalism. The event is part of a broader context of claiming the consumption of milk as a metaphor for the affirmation of a white and masculine superiority. Also in 2017, James Alsup, a member of the alternative right, published a satirical video on YouTube in which he explains how to become anti-fascist, associating the consumption of soy milk, considered a sign of weakness and lack of virility, instead of cow's milk, to the anti-fascist and feminist cause. Following these episodes, the hashtags Milk Twitter and Soy Boy went viral, while various components of alt-right affiliated groups began using milk symbolism on social media to celebrate traditional gender roles and white masculinity, while simultaneously belittling and mocking diversity and movements that oppose hetero-patriarchal white oppression. The association between cow's milk and white supremacy, which primarily leverages on color continuity, is coupled with the idea that lactose intolerance has a greater incidence on African South American population and African American and Native American communities. An article published in 2013 in Nature magazine shows a map of the spread of lactose intolerance and consequently of resistance to it thanks to the presence of the enzyme lactase. A map that some exponents of the alt-right have appropriated to support their thesis, namely that the presence of the enzyme lactase, more frequent in Caucasian populations, is the evidence of a genetic and biological racial superiority. The presence of such symbolism can be explained in the contemporary context by the perceived increased threat to heteropatriarchal white hegemony caused by transnational migration movements, the growing multicultural connotation of Western society, and the strong and increasingly widespread focus not only on the constructed character of gender, but also on homophobic, transphobic, and racist discrimination, on the exploitation of animals in the meat and dairy industry, and on the environmentalist cause. In this regard, scholar Iselin Gambert shows how for a long time milk has been used as a means of reaffirming white supremacy and has been presented as a healthy and fortifying food, while 65% of the world's population is unable to digest it, and outlines forms of activism for the so-called post-milk generation. Vasile Stanescu brings out the link between milk consumption, dietary racism, and imperialism, arguing that the rhetoric that lactose resistance is more spread in colonizing populations whose economies have developed in a capitalistic way is used by right-wingers as a scientific proof of the natural superiority of white populations over non-white populations, among whom lactose intolerance has a higher incidence. Such rhetoric is still taken up today, according to Stanescu, by those who attempt to give a biological explanation for the inequalities between the global North and South, within having to resort explicitly to scientific racism. It emerges then how milk comes into strong connection with issues related to race and colonialism, but also to the new neo-Nazi movements and the environmentalist and feminist movements. If the association between blackness and chocolate or coffee is part of a process of hetero-referential racialization because it structures a black otherness in opposition to which whiteness becomes the neutral norm, the link between milk and white supremacy is structured through a process of self-referential racialization, and the rise of this discourse is carried out by those neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups that seems to dangerously re-emerge. And I think that I can stop here. Thank you. I just have to. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, original, and many implications of your conference, political, social, anthropological, historical. Very, very interesting. Then I have you possible to stay for some minutes, Giulia? 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There are some questions. Any questions by the student, Francisca, Georgia, Moroccan? Georgia, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Giulia. It was very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you, can you please leave your email in the chat so that we can contact you directly and, I don't know, get some pictures, like whatever you had in your amazing presentation? That will be very, very helpful.
Yes, Georgia, thank you. And yes, of course, I leave my contact and my mail contact on in the chat if I figure out how to do this, maybe in this way.
Thank you.
And yes, of course, I really invite you to write me for any questions or ideas or suggestions or thoughts or reflections or whatever. Yes.
Okay, other questions?
Right.
Sorry.
No, oh, okay. Yes, I find.
Other
I'm leaving
questions?
my email in the chat.
Student first, otherwise I try to address a question.
Yes, absolutely, Gabriele. If you have any questions, go to Giulia.
Okay.
Please, Gabriele.
Thank you, Giulia. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. And we have in common this topic, this research, because I worked on race, gender, and whiteness in other fields. And when I arrived and was based at Uni SG, I started this path. Maybe there are some differences in terms of goal, because my aim is to point out the value in terms of production of imaginary, and on the other way, how colonies became important for the modernization of Europe in terms of production of different tastes, etc. But my question is in a sort of zone of common between me and you and our interests, and is about the specificity of the Italian narration, and so the Italian imaginary, about chocolate and coffee. If, in your opinion, the Italian whiteness is different from other whitenesses, such as, for example, France or the Netherlands, and on the other side of the ocean, the US, because the production of US which has a different historical root based on segregation and slavery, but there's the same use of chocolate for this significance and this meaning. So this is the question, and then I'm very interested in reading your book, which will be soon out.
Yes, thank you, Gabriele, for your question. Yes, it's a very big question. I mean that in my research, what I found out is that there are two levels that runs in some kind of a parallel way. I mean that on the one hand, the discourse in the field of advertising, of course, the discourse constructed on the association of blackness with chocolate and cocoa, it seems to be included inside a wider discourse, a global discourse about the association between blackness, chocolate and coffee, production of chocolate and coffee. And this is why I often refer to the US context, you know. But on the other hand, as you were saying, US and Italy, as well as Europe, have a very different racial history. Racial history is rooted in the slavery and plantation system. European racial history is rooted in colonialism. So it produces very different national racial histories. And the Italian context is even more specific because regarding your question about whiteness, for example, the whiteness of Italians has always been very questioned, also because of the racialization of South Italians, and later of the immigration in mass of Italians in the US, where Italians were considered, as you know, non-white or dark, or sometimes were in a social position more similar to black people than white Americans, you know. So, but on the other side, on the third side, on the other side, Italians constructed themselves as white. So, but as a very invisible whiteness, you know. So this is a whiteness that doesn't need to be claimed, doesn't need to be expressed. And therefore, there is another part of the research that I have no time today to expose you, but in which I analyze some advertisings in which black models are depicted besides white models. And there is often this, of course, opposition between black and white, in which the blackness is functional to reaffirming the neutrality of whiteness. So it's highlighting the focusing the attention of the image on the black model and on blackness associated to a specific product. It's a tool in order to reaffirm the whiteness as the norm, as some kind of norm. So I think that, and I was also thinking another thing while you were talking. I was thinking about what David Theo Goldberg says about the externalization of colonialism, of European colonial history, so that in US racial history occurred within their national territory. And so all the questions related to race and whiteness are displayed on the national territories in a situation of close proximity, while in the European case, the racial history a part of racial history occurred outside national territories, in the colonies, and therefore there is also this difficult to talking about race and whiteness and white supremacy and white privilege in Italy and in other countries such as France, but I'm also thinking to Germany, who erased the word race from the constitution maybe a couple of months ago. So yeah, I think that the discourse about the association between chocolate and cocoa and blackness is included within a wider discourse about these issues. But even if there are different racial histories, and this is, I think, an evidence of the fact that in different ways and with taking into account all the different specificities, local specificities, but racial categories travel, in the space and in the time, and therefore we can find similar features and similar elements also in different contexts with different histories. And yeah, I don't know if I have answered your question.
Sure. The idea of the traveling theory and also the memory as an archive of representations. And I agree with you for two reasons. The first one is that one advertisement of yours, Z Cafe, is a Sicilian one. So I think that the idea of proposing something connected to a construction of blackness, which from the other side, the side of the people who has to see, and so is a sort of gaze or whiteness gaze on the food, is something that can be salvific for Europe. And the second one is because, in my opinion, I really appreciated, I would like to quote like that because the discourse is very long. I really appreciated the fact of connecting milk and coffee and chocolate, because are parts of the same unique discourse, in my opinion, when we focus on some identities and construction of subjectivities. So thank you so much, Giulia.
Thank you too.
Okay, thank you. This is other questions. Finally, the final question, or supposed to finish this very interesting conference.
Because Giulia said that at 7 o'clock.
Oh yeah.
Okay,
thank you very much, Giulia. I hope to see you with Gabriele in Pollenzo or in presence in the future, because your arguments is very interesting. Are very interesting for the development of the study about food and consumption, and is very important for all the students, not only Italian students but also international students. It's a part of history of Italy and not only, and about racism, about gender. There are a fundamental and strategic theme in contemporary cultural debate. Thank you, Giulia. Grazie. And
thank you. Thank you. It would be a pleasure to keep in contact with you and maybe meet live someday.
Absolutely.
Sure,
absolutely.
We will
Gabriele is the important colleague that create this very important contacts with historic, etc. Okay, thank you, Francisca, and good evening to all. Buona serata a tutti. The next conference is Monday with a Turkish colleague about food, Turkish food, and probably is suggest that it will be presented by Gabriele probably Monday, I suppose.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you Gabriele, grazie a tutti, thank you to all e buonasera.
Grazie,
Ciao
Giulia.
Giulia, grazie.
Grazie mille,
Ciao.
a presto.
Ciao.
Good evening, a presto, ciao.